Chapter 44. The group was escorted up the stairs and through what looked to be a back room and a small kitchen before they arrived in an open, converted warehouse. The room was large, easily holding over 100 people. The ceiling was tall and unfinished. Panic threatened to pull Alicia under as she realized that this place was nearly a twin of the club where she had first met the king. It seemed he had a preferred type of venue. Loitering around the walls was the king's court. The faces were dirt-covered, and the clothing had gone from fine linen to a desperate need to be washed. The room was gloomy, built without a way for natural light to enter, and covered in limited fluorescent lights. It reflected off the people's faces, washing out their natural pigment. The entire room of people was focused on their group's entrance. The crowd watched them with a mass of expressionless faces. No, not expressionless. As Alicia studied the people more closely, she saw signs of fear and exhaustion that they were trying to hide. Alicia's eyes were drawn to the back of the room, where a spotlight highlighted parts of a stage. In the center of the spotlight, the king perched on an armed wooden chair. The chair was generic, the type that one would find at a kitchen table or chain restaurant, yet the king perched on it like it was a grand throne. His legs were spread wide, taking up as much space as possible. They were covered in a ridiculous pair of purple striped slacks. His hands, the same hands that had once grabbed her long ago, were clasped in between his legs as he leaned forward slightly. When Alicia finally managed to pull her eyes up to his face, she froze with anger, bile filling her mouth. Her hand reached out instinctively for her son, fumbling until she found his shoulder and pulled him closer to her. The king was looking at them like he was examining an interesting bug or some curious anomaly, even though he was the one dressed in a purple silk shirt with puffed-up sleeves and a V-neck that went clear down to the middle of his chest. He wore several necklaces in an emulation that had not gone well. Instead of gold links, he wore gold lockets, diamond pendants, and even a few sets of pearls. Yet the ridiculousness of the outfit did nothing to offset the look he threw her way. Like they were garbage, barely worthy of his time. It was so much harsher than the look he had given her last, before he had torn her entire world apart. Sudden movement caught her eye, and two elves in black suits and ties walked in from the shadows. In between them, a man was draped, one arm over each of their shoulders. Although they were holding on to each arm to keep him up, they dumped him on the floor next to the king, and Alicia let out a gasp when she finally recognized Retta. He crouched on the floor. His shirt was missing and bright red bruising stood out across his olive skin. When Retta looked up, Alicia could not help but let out another gasp. His lip was split, with dried blood covering the lower half of his face. His eyes were nearly swollen shut, and an entire ear seemed to be missing. This wasn't the plan. Retta wasn't even supposed to be here. He was supposed to slip over after them and make the call to turn them in. Then he was supposed to use his resources to get away and go into hiding until one way or another this day was over. If they didn't make it out, he was supposed to find her son when shifted in between the worlds. Retta was her backup plan, her way of knowing her son would be safe even if she wasn't. Yet here he was, broken almost beyond the point of recognition. Alicia turned to Sadar, uncertain what to do next, but he stood stoic and unmoved. He looked directly at the king, not even acknowledging his fiancée. Suddenly he moved, slipping easily out of the grasp of his escorts through the open floor, where he bounded onto the stage. Two more suit-wearing goons slipped out of the shadows, but Sadar was already laying prostrate on the floor, bowing to the king. "My body, blood, and life are hereby bound to the throne," Sadar said quickly but loudly. In the silence, the words seemed almost to echo. Sadar lifted his bound hands, as if worshipping the king as he spoke. Alicia could not keep the betrayal off her face at the display, but soon she noticed that the nobility had begun murmuring. A few were even openly gesturing, as if their own hands were bound, their eyes wide with disbelief. "Isn't that the Bloodsworn?" "He has to bind his own Bloodsworn?" The words flittered around the crowd, bringing the people to life. Alicia was startled to realize that some of the crowd was speaking English and not Elven. But given his emulation of human culture, it probably wasn't that surprising. Sadar kept to his knees. His head stayed bowed, but his hands remained raised so all could see. Alicia was not sure what he had done, except that he had done something. After the king did not react, the murmuring started getting louder. Alicia heard more rumblings about the Bloodsworn being a prisoner. As near as Alicia could tell, Sadar had just made the king look bad by showing that he had to keep him under guard, the one person who had to protect the throne at all costs. Alicia realized in that moment how much having someone strong enough to hold the throne meant to these people. After years of his abuse, it took just the thought of his weakness for them to start to revolt. She started to have hope their plan would work. It had to work. The king must have felt the growing change in the court as well. He stood up from his throne and gestured towards Sadar. "Rise," he said, and then raised his hand as if making Sadar do just that. Sadar followed the prompting and rose. It all seemed over the top to Alicia, but then she supposed the king was trying to save face in front of everyone. He had to earn back the respect that Sadar had just cost him. The worst part was something so simple seemed to be working. The people had stopped murmuring and had turned expectantly towards the stage. "Untie him. The Bloodsworn should never have been brought to me as a prisoner. He is my trusted guard and should be at my side." He talked as if he had not been the one to command Sadar to be in prison in the first place, or to keep him away from this makeshift castle. Alicia had to try hard not to roll her eyes at how overdramatic everyone seemed to be. Sadar seemed to take it all in stride. He waited while they removed his bindings. Then he moved to stand at the side of the king. Seeing Sadar back at the king's side was the ultimate betrayal. Alicia found herself again unable to hide her distaste. Alicia turned to her son. She was afraid to speak, so she gave him her mom look, which he instantly recognized. He unhappily gave a slight nod. If the time came, he would leave, she hoped. The king finally turned his full attention towards her and Kenny. He looked at her and then gave a slight nod. "Yes, I think I remember you. It is hard to be sure, there have been so many." There was a round of laughter from his court, but not everyone joined in. The crowd was not as devoted to him as he would want. "Bring them here." Alicia felt one of the suited men put his hand on her shoulder and push her towards the stage. She pulled her son in front of her before the guards could touch him and walked towards the king. Kenny looked up at her with fear, and she managed to give him a reassuring smile. She hoped that he could not see her own panic. When they had made it to the front of the stage, the king turned his attention to his son. "He's not much to look at." The crowd let out another polite laugh. "Kill the boy, but not the mother. Not yet, at least. Bring her up to my bedroom." "No!" Alicia screamed. "You cannot harm him! He is your son!" "That is exactly why I must harm him. The throne is mine, and I will not have any son of mine trying to take it from me." The king had publicly declared Kenny to be his son. Alicia hoped that it was enough. "You would order your heir and prince of the in-between to be slaughtered like some common criminal? If he is your son, then shouldn't he at least receive death by your hands? Doesn't your law state that the punishment for killing a prince is a gruesome death?" The guards paused and looked towards the king. They seemed unsure of which was worse, the fate of killing the prince or the consequences for disobeying the king. Alicia felt guilty for the fear in their eyes. "The great thing about laws is that I can change them. All I have to do is flick my wrist and poof, the law is gone. Kill him." The guards took a hesitant step towards her son. Alicia glanced towards the king. "It would help if you changed the law. I am sure these guards do not want to die for obeying you." "Kill him!" "You are going to send 2 innocent guards to kill the rightful prince, your heir? I didn't peg you for such a coward." That got the attention of the court. They began to murmur again. Alicia thought that she saw elves slip away, maybe heading back to the in-between. The king must have noticed it as well. "Cowards!" the king bellowed. "If you will not kill them, then you will pay. Kill them!" The king turned to one of the men that had carried in Retta. The man moved to the front of the stage and took out a gun from under his suit jacket. He held it up and waved it around, accidentally firing off a shot. The bullet pinged off the metal ceiling. What happened next was lost in a sea of screaming. The crowd started scattering, some disappearing right from the spot they stood in. Alicia had grabbed Kenny and wrapped herself around him, shielding him as much as she could. "You need to go," she sobbed in his ear, but Sadar started talking over everyone. His words transported directly to everyone in the room in what must have been a use of illusionary magic. Surely you do not need to resort to using human weapons to maintain the in-between. I am so happy that I was able to find you so that I can help bring order to the throne." The room started to settle, and the remaining elves, about half the room, now stared back up at the stage. Alicia glanced over her shoulder. The king was looking at Cedar with such hatred. He picked up a sword that was looped over the back of his chair. Before he could do more than put it in his hands, Cedar was talking again. "Of course the prince cannot be killed. You need an heir to the throne. I know it is unconventional that your son is half human, but you are so fortunate that he was born. While I was, well, let's say exploring the human world, I heard that you had to have a human operation, the kind that does not allow you to have any more children. We are so lucky that your son was found." "What type of operation?" The voice sounded familiar, and Alicia was not surprised when she saw the Count walk out of the crowd. Cedar turned towards the king, as if he expected the king to answer the question. He just stood there, a tall purple stick, holding on to his sheathed sword with tight fists. "I won't go into too much detail because we have some children in the room, but humans have a procedure that makes it impossible to have any more children. The king is infertile. With the unfortunate accidents that have befallen the royal line, there is no one that could inherit the throne." The entire room of people stood as if in shock. The goon with the gun put it back under his jacket and walked off the stage. The rest of the suited guards walked out after him. Alicia watched them leave. Then she turned towards Cedar in confusion. He continued, ignoring her. Instead, she found Retta, who gave her a small smile on the half of his lips that weren't swollen. The people slowly had come to life again. They were pointing at Kenny now, their eyes darting towards her son and the king. Alicia stood back up, now that the gun was gone. Kenny stood still next to her, letting them look. Alicia allowed herself to think of the best-case scenario. The king having to accept her son as heir, them working to make the world better without bloodshed, and without her having to become regent for her son. The king slung his sword over his head so that it lay across his back. Then he walked down the side of the stage in some steps hidden in shadows. He stopped right in front of them, his eyes a vacant gaze that never left Kenny. Then his hands reached up, pulling the sword from the sheath. Alicia watched the blade inch towards Kenny's chest. It was so close, and they had lost. He needed to get out of there now. Alicia called to her son, telling him to go, but the blade stopped as soon as it touched the prince's chest. It dropped, clattering on the ground. The king's eyes were wide. Blood was pooling out of his mouth. He looked down and saw a blade piercing his heart. He gave a final look at his son and then fell to the ground. Cedar was standing right behind. "I have protected the prince and rightful heir of the in-between, so named by his father, King Taro II. His father attempted to kill him in cold blood without the benefit of a trial. As blood sworn, I had no choice but to defend the prince. I now face the judgment of the crown." Alicia stood frozen, watching the blood pool on the ground. It had been so close to being her son. That thought brought her back, and she noticed her son also staring at the man who had tried to kill him. She turned him away from the body and towards the crowd of elves. Later they would process what had happened. They would find an elven therapist and work through the nightmares that were sure to come. But for now, they were not finished.